Costa from the Behavioural Insights Team, and this morning it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Sunstein. A little over 10 years ago, Professor Sunstein co-authored Nudge with Richard Thaler, and together they sparked a new way of thinking about and designing public policy. Indeed, the ideas and potential presented in Nudge are the reason that many of us are here in this room today, eager to learn about the new frontiers of behavioural science and how to apply it to our work. Professor Sunstein's career marks many highlights and an incredible breadth of expertise, from behavioural economics to environmental, constitutional, and administrative law. From 2009 to 2012, Professor Sunstein was Administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and in 2018 he was awarded the prestigious Holberg Prize for outstanding contributions to research in the humanities and social sciences. He's currently the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard, where he founded and serves as Director of the Program on Behavioural Economics and Public Policy at Harvard Law School. Professor Sunstein continues to be at the forefront of the biggest and thorniest policy issues of our time. This year alone, he's published over 20 articles and 4 books, keeping in mind it is only September, on topics ranging from the constitutional status of falsehoods, through to algorithmic bias and discrimination, through to sludge. And this morning, with the backdrop of a turbulent time in Westminster and indeed the world, we're going to dive into a discussion on Cass's latest book, How Change Happens. So please welcome Professor Sunstein to the stage.
Well, it's a thrill to be here. The combination of creativity and commitment in this room is more than inspiring. I'm seeing a lot of people I know, and it's been 10 years of amazingness, and the next 10 years are going to be larger. With that point in mind, I thought what I would do is step back and explore some large questions about change. Some of these issues involve things that are world transforming. Some of them involve issues that are week transforming. That is, they'll change someone's or a bunch of people's experience of 6 or 7 days. But the focus is going to be on very large scale change and the difficulty of anticipating it and the opportunity sometimes to shift it with small things in surprisingly big directions. I have 2 stories that are at the core of the little framework I'm going to offer. A few years ago, not long ago, I found myself in a group of about 12 people talking to one of the great athletes in the world, and I'm not going to disclose his name for reasons that will become obvious momentarily. He's someone who is famously phenomenal, and he is recognized as one of the all-time best. I thought I'd ask him a question that I always wanted to ask one of the world's great athletes. I said to him in this group of 10 or 12 people, a little group, I said, if the game is at the end and it's really close and everything depends on you, imagine it's the last moments of the game and it's all on your shoulders. He's the best, by the way, so this is not an unusual phenomenon for him. I asked him, are you having fun? And his response, he looked me right in the eye, and then he looked around the group, and he said, absolutely. I said, that's what I live for. I've been trained to be a good performer in those situations. I've got the biggest smile on my face. I'm good at it. I know I'm good at it. I love it. Everybody kind of nodded with admiration, and I found that surprising. I confess, I play a little sport called squash, and my squash friends, even the ones who are really, really good, I'm not sure they'd say that. So about half an hour later, I took him aside, and this was slightly antisocial, but I did it with warmth. And I said, we went in the corner, just the two of us, and I said, your answer really surprised me. Is that true, that you're having fun? And he said, do you want the real answer? And I said, yeah. He said, I hate it. He said, it's completely horrible. He said, don't get me wrong. I'm good. I know what to do. And he said it with, as a fact rather than bragging. He said, I'm good. I'm trained to do it, but the pressure's immense. It's a terrible experience. I hate it. Now, that was interesting. The second tale is a little more directly policy-oriented, and it's based on data from Saudi Arabia, where by custom, husbands get to decide whether their wives enter the labor force. And female labor force participation is very low in Saudi Arabia. So in this study, which was randomized, young Saudi men were asked in private, what do you think about your wife working outside of the home? And the overwhelming majority said, that's great. I'm completely for that. It's good for the family. It's good for the economy. I like the idea. Then they were asked, what do you think other young Saudi men like you think? And they said overwhelmingly, they think it's a terrible idea. I'm maybe the only one who thinks that. Everyone else like me thinks no. Okay, now as it was randomized, half of the people in that group were informed that actually their own privately expressed view was representative of their peer group. Young Saudi men were told in half of the group, actually, your view, that's what people like you think. That is a widely shared view. Okay, here's the policy outcome. 4 months later, in the treatment group, the number of wives who had applied and interviewed for jobs, 4 months later, skyrocketed. A massive increase in efforts by women in Saudi Arabia to join the labor force. Many of those efforts were successful. Okay, these stories look different, but they're exactly the same story. They're stories about the difference between what people have in their heads and what they're willing to say in a confidential setting and what they're willing to say publicly. There's often a big division. Okay, my puzzle is, why does social change seem to come out of nowhere when it's often big? And correlative question, how can we start it or stop it when that's a desirable thing to do? My hope is that the answers are going to tell us something about Brexit. There's a contractual obligation that that word be mentioned. Civil rights movements of the 1960s, the rise of fascism in the 1930s, contemporary populism, #MeToo, and movements on the horizon only that we can barely see. Okay, to vindicate the premise of these remarks, which is the difficulty of anticipating even large-scale social change, Lenin was stunned by the success and speed of the Russian Revolution. Let's pause over that. Lenin was stunned by the success and speed of the Russian Revolution. He was the architect. He had no idea. If you're making a catalog of the greatest social theorists in the history of the human species, Tocqueville would clearly belong on the list. He might head the list. Tocqueville, who was there at the time, reported that no one foresaw the French Revolution. No one. The Iranian Revolution of 1789 was widely unanticipated. If you look at the pictures of the participants in the Iranian Revolution, you can see two things on their faces. One is exaltation that it's actually working. The other is amazement that they weren't all dead. It worked. More recently, the Arab Spring was unanticipated by the best analysts, by and large, here and in the United States. And I know that because I was in the White House at the time, and I saw in real time the disbelief on the part of the best specialists in the United States that the Arab Spring was actually happening. Okay. Some people who study these topics refer to contagion effects, saying that change often spreads like a virus or a disease. But there's a little parallel between pointing to contagion effects and saying that opium induces sleep because of its dormitive properties. It's a redescription. It's not an explanation to say there's contagion, yes? So what's needed is micro-foundations of social change, both the big change and the little ones. Okay, I'm going to try to get at this through a quartet of points. The star performer is signaled by my opening tales, and that is preference falsification. Every human being has in her or his head a belief or a value or a desire that either no one or hardly anyone knows about. The story of the professional athlete is a story of preference falsification, where he said what he likes, which isn't true, and the exact same is so of the young Saudi men. If there is a difference between what's in our head and what we're willing to say or do, there's a volcano ready to explode. That can be a horrible thing. It can be a wonderful thing. The only point for present purposes is that there's a volcano present. There's an opportunity. The second of the quartet of points is diverse thresholds, which means that each person has a different threshold. Something has to happen for them to say or do what they want, and what that thing actually is differs depending on who you are. I'm going to explain that momentarily. The third idea is social interdependencies. So whether Taylor Swift, the immortal Taylor Swift, becomes Taylor Swift, or just someone who had a failed music career, depends in large part on whether other people are observed as loving, as they should, Taylor Swift. If other people aren't observed loving Taylor Swift, it might be that individuals will think, well, I kind of like her, but let's listen to Beyonce. Let's try Beyonce instead. Social interdependencies point to the potential for something big, like the Arab Spring, or something little that's so little that it's lost to history because it never turned into anything. The last of the quartet of points is group polarization, which we're seeing all over the world and on Twitter and Facebook every day, by which like-minded people engaged in conversation with one another typically end up in a more extreme position in line with what they thought before they started to talk. I'll give you a little story right now. This is abstract. I'm going to make it more concrete, but I'll make it concrete immediately by reference to some stunning data from China, which shows its keen awareness of the mechanisms I've just discussed and the circumstances for social change. Research by Gary King, a political scientist who's worked cooperatively with the Chinese government, has uncovered the following, to me, surprising fact. On Chinese social media, there's a lot of room allowed for dissent. On social media, if people say, I think the government's not doing a good job with respect to X or Y or Z, as a first approximation, that's tolerated. There's a lot of freedom for expressed views. The government's response might be to include into the system a lot of alternative positions, suggesting that actually the government's doing a really good job and that the disagreement and negativity is unearned. But the censorship is somewhere between trivial and modest. By contrast, if someone says, we're going to meet at night at a stated time, at a stated address on a Tuesday, that will be taken down. That's a problem. Now, the asymmetry between allowing isolated expressions of concern and not allowing planned movements arranged in places at specified times. That's shrewd, whether or not it's freedom-preserving. It's shrewd because it shows an alertness to the four mechanisms I've discussed. It's trying to stop group polarization. It's trying to reduce the effect of social interdependencies in promoting change. Okay, these four ideas not only can help explain the difficulty of anticipating social change, why it often comes from out of the blue, but also they can be used to promote social change. We all know, thanks in large part to amazing work done by the Behavioural Insights Team, about the power of social norms. In my nominee for the best unknown behavioral science paper of the last 6 or 7 years, it's shown that if there isn't a social norm that's usable now, because people aren't doing the desirable thing, you can often get traction by telling people there is an emerging social norm to this effect, that people are increasingly doing this or that. The dynamic emerging norm often energizes change and becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The exact mechanism isn't clear. It might be that people think that if people are increasingly doing something, then they know something that the rest of us don't. Or it might be, and I suspect something like this is true, that people don't want to be on the wrong side of history, either in the cases studied for moral reasons, these are studies of sustainability, they don't want to be on the wrong side of history there, or because they think that the way directions history is going is kind of a heuristic for the right way to go. And on either view, one involves information, what people are increasingly doing is the right thing to do, or involves normative evaluation, it's morally correct, not just smart. In either case, pointing to the dynamic social norm can unlock change. Okay, with respect to preference falsification, books about Nazism are often, for a good reason, really hard going. They don't brighten one's day. There's one book, I confess, that I find brightening to read by a journalist of German ancestry who in the 1950s went back to Germany to ask, how did Nazism come about? How did it happen that his people basically did this? And what makes it not hard going is that the author ended up liking all of the former Nazis, every single one. And any reader of the book is going to like them too. They're good people, every single one, caught in circumstances that are, beyond horrific. Here's a comment by one of the author's friends, as he described them, who was asked, what were you all thinking under Hitler? Didn't you oppose Hitler? And his friend said, opposition? How would anybody know? How would anybody know what somebody else opposes or doesn't oppose? That a man says he opposes or doesn't oppose depends on the circumstances, where and when and to whom and just how he says it. And even then you must guess why he says what he says. That's stunning, isn't it? And this isn't by a social theorist. This is just an offhand comment by someone living under horrific circumstances. The claim is that what people are willing to say and do publicly is a product of social influences, and often a voice in the head saying this is intolerable and a living nightmare might be silenced by virtue of what else is around. What the former Nazi is speaking of is pluralistic ignorance in which each of us doesn't know about the preferences and values of others. Not fully. Every human being conceals or doesn't reveal, at least some of the time, what they actually prefer and think. They silence themselves, which means their friends and neighbors might have a less than adequate sense of what they really think. Now, this isn't necessarily bad It makes civilization possible. If everyone said all the time what's in her or his head, it would be pretty unpleasant, yes? So this is not something to deplore, but it's both an opportunity for something big to happen, and it is a brake on big things happening. The challenge is that social norms or the law can draw a wedge between what people will say privately and what people will say publicly. What's needed is something like a norm entrepreneur who's able to give a green light or a permission slip, after which people will actually say what they think. And with respect to Brexit, on both sides now, and with respect to #MeToo, certainly, with respect to populism, with respect to feminism, that green light or permission slip has, at crucial moments, been given. Okay, the words from the former Nazi, or from the 1950s, here's some words very recent from a computer programmer from Syria. When you meet somebody coming out of Syria for the first time, you start to hear the same sentences. Everything is okay inside Syria. Syria is a great country. The economy is doing great. It'll take him 6 months, up to a year, to become a normal human being again, to say what he thinks, what he feels. Then he might start whispering. They won't speak loudly. That's too scary. After all that time, even outside Syria, you feel that someone is listening, someone is recording. That's very dramatic because it's about a government and fear of it. But in democratic societies, too, there's a soft echo of that, a sense that someone is listening, someone is recording. I'll tell you a personal tale, because we're all friends. Shall I tell you a personal tale? When I was up for the confirmation by the US Senate, I had a lot of trouble. It was a 9-month colonoscopy, I think is the technical term. It was a terrible experience. One of the most surprising and difficult parts was I wrote a paper on animal welfare, basically. And I care about animal welfare. And because of what I'm about to tell you, even as I tell you that right now, something inside me is shaking with fear. And the reason was that my little paper on animal welfare produced a torrent of social norm opprobrium, including credible death threats that I received at my enlisted home address. It was so vicious and violent, the reaction to what I said, that I've been, in some ways, quieted successfully for a while with respect to animal welfare. And this is in a fully democratic society in which the wrath of social norms, which are, in a government job, you ought not to be keenly concerned with social welfare, the wrath works as an effective deterrent. Okay, now the second of the moving parts, diverse thresholds. A few years ago, I was in a dangerous part of the world, let's just call it that, and it's not English speaking. And I was there with an Irish-American law professor. We were there on business, and we were taking a little walk on the street, not a safe neighborhood. We saw on the street a father beating up his 10-year-old son, physically, on the street. And this was not soft beating. He was pummeling his 10-year-old son, about 200 meters away. Before I could internalize what was happening, my Irish-American friend ran to the scene, and he's not very tall, and he started saying in English, "Stop hitting your son." And while the father was not able to understand English, he was able to understand what my friend was saying to him, and he looked at him in a way that suggested this was an ugly confrontation about to happen. I was right behind my Irish-American friend. Now, I say that with a little bit of embarrassment. He was there like lightning. I was there like a little better than molasses. But I was right behind him. Okay, his threshold for responding to a parent beating up his child was 0. Mine, I think, was 1 in the sense that I would respond to the event. Certainly, if someone came before me, I don't know what I would have done if he hadn't acted. Some people are rebels by nature. He, in this respect, is, my friend. He is courageous, committed, and possibly foolhardy. In social circumstances, people like him might look radical, foolish, or crazy. They are 0s in the sense that they don't need any social support. The 0s and the 1s are accompanied in any group, including a country, by the 2s, who will act only if they see the 0s and the 1s. And I studied a lot of high-level math for this talk, so I'm here to report that the 3s are followed by the 4s, and eventually the 10s, and the 100s, and the 1000s, all the way up to the infinites, who are really interesting. They won't participate in a movement. They won't change from the status quo, either because of habit, fear, loyalty, something else. And if you're thinking of feminism and #MeToo in this connection, good. It's an example. Okay, the kicker is we can't observe people's thresholds. It's really hard to know what's in people's heads, to know their preferences. To know their thresholds is even harder. Even more dramatically, each of us probably doesn't know our thresholds. Whether we will participate in X or Y or Z, whether it's energy conservation or savings or something that involves injustice, we probably don't ourselves know, and it will vary area to area. Here are some words from John Adams, writing with astonishment about the American Revolution. Idolatry to monarchs and servility to aristocratical pride was never eradicated from so many minds in so short a time. Thomas Paine, author of a book called Common Sense, put it this way: our style and manner of thinking have undergone a revolution more extraordinary than the political revolution. We see with other eyes, we hear with other ears, and think with other thoughts than those we formerly used. It's not wise to argue with John Adams and Thomas Paine, but as someone who spent a lot of the last 2 years in their generation, I have a friendly amendment to them. It's not quite right to say that they see with other eyes or hear with other ears or think with other thoughts. It's that something inside their minds was unleashed and unlocked by virtue of a permission slip given by the 0s and the 1s and the 2s, 2 of whom were John Adams and Thomas Paine. There was a voice in the head saying independence is a good idea and so is human equality. But it didn't speak until the green light was given. Okay, third of the 3 moving parts is interdependencies. So much depends on who, if anyone, is seen to have done what. Beverley Young Nelson accused a famous politician named Roy Moore of having sexually assaulted her in 1977. Here's what she said about her behavior. I thought I was his only victim. That's what I thought. I would probably have taken what he did to me to my grave, except for the courage of 4 other women who were willing to speak out about their experiences. Their courage has inspired me to overcome my fear. By her account, she's a 5. She required the 4. There's that level of interdependence. Okay, the upshot is that under the right circumstances, a movement is going to occur, but only given the right distribution of thresholds and the right kind of visibility. If the 1s see the 0s, as I did on a dangerous street, they'll join. And if the twos see the ones, they too will. And if three sees the twos, they'll join them. If the conditions are right, everything will change. If they aren't right, nothing will change. It will peter out, and the history books won't record what could have been a very big deal. Okay, the last moving part involves group polarization, and I'm going to talk here about one issue, climate change. A few years ago, I got a group of people who tended to be concerned about climate change. They were diverse in their intensity. Some of them were not that concerned, but on average, they were concerned. They wanted something like the Paris Treaty, on average. I got them in a room, a bunch of such groups in a room of 6 people, asked them first to record their views anonymously, then to deliberate to a group verdict, and then to say privately what they thought. Here's what happened. Every one of the 6 groups went whoosh, meaning they went to the left. After they talked to one another, they were unified, confident, and extreme in their commitment to an international treaty, just as a result of speaking with like-minded others. In the exact same period, I did the same study with a number of groups of people who weren't that concerned about climate change. They weren't deniers, but they thought, on average, they thought an international treaty is not a good idea. They started thinking it's not a good idea to have an international treaty. They ended, after talking to one another, thinking this climate change stuff is a hoax, it's made up, it's a terrible thing, this treaty idea. As a result of a brief period of interaction, 2 groups which were somewhat disparate. On average, they liked the treaty. On average, they didn't like the treaty. After they talked with one another, in their anonymous views, they were in different political universes. One, if it was the whole society, would get out of Paris yesterday. The other, if it was the whole society, would sign on and make it more aggressive today. Okay, we can now see, I think, why large-scale movements and smaller ones and big revolutions are impossible to predict, and we have some clues about how to produce them. First, by hypothesis, we don't know what's inside people's heads. That's a problem and an opportunity. Even more, we don't know what people's thresholds are. They themselves don't know. We may go all in on electric cars here in a short time, partly because people have different thresholds and they don't know what they are. Third, and I think most powerfully, we can't anticipate social interactions. We can't know who will say what to whom and at what time. Fourth, it's very hard to know when the conditions for group polarization are going to occur, in the sense that an entrepreneur of some kind or another will succeed in getting like-minded people together. Okay, these points have prescriptive implications. With respect to disability rights, feminism, and animal rights, such success that has been occurred has been a product of falsified preferences being unfalsified, of diverse thresholds being triggered, of social interactions sometimes working to favor change, and of group polarization fueling it. There's an author of a book, he may be in this room, I don't think so, it's a very good book. It has the captivating title, Behavioral Finance. Behavioral science would be captivating. Behavioral finance, not quite captivating, and this isn't Bob Schiller's book. It draws a lot on Bob Schiller's work. It's a superb book. It's not doing that well in terms of sales. It's a good book, it's not selling very well. But the author tweets periodically, "My book is doing much better than expectations. Thank you for the support." That's smart. It's selling better than it otherwise would because of what he tweets. What he's doing there in a tiny way is the mirror image of what the Chinese government is doing on a large-scale way in trying to stem social interactions, diverse thresholds, preference revelation as sources of change. Okay, the largest point about predicting what's going to happen in the next decade is that large-scale reforms are unpredictable in principle. We often think that they're a product of history's inevitable course, but it's better to say that small, random, or serendipitous factors drove everything. Who did what when, who heard what when, and whether some kind of butterfly happened to flap its wings at the right moment. When some practice changes, we often think that was inevitable, but it really wasn't. It happened to change. The same is true if it doesn't change. It happened not to change. Okay, I'm mostly done. I'm going to conclude by introducing 3 supplemental points to the framework just introduced. So the framework says we have stuff in our heads that we don't disclose. We have diverse thresholds for acting. Social interactions are crucial and hard to predict, and group polarization can make all the difference. Okay, to get at the first of my 3 supplemental points, here are some words basically from yesterday from North Korea. A woman who is out. It never occurred to me that I could or would want to do anything about it. It was just how things are. Now, the most brutally powerful word in that haiku is the word want. It never occurred to me that I could or would want to do anything about it. That's not about preference falsification. That's not the professional athlete or the Saudi men. It's about the formation of desires based on what seems like life's furniture. Now, sometimes it's right to speak about adaptive preferences, preferences that are adaptive to what society contains, and so our wants are a function of them. Sometimes it's better to think of partially adaptive preferences in which people are aware that something is wrong or bad or horrific, but the awareness takes the form of a small suppressed voice in the head to which people don't pay much attention. The idea of preference falsification is too simple in those circumstances. Okay, when I was putting together these remarks, I remembered something I had forgotten that happened a number of years ago. In the 1980s, I was first reading about feminism in law and policy. It was taking off in law schools, and my mother called me on Sunday, as she always did. We talked every day, every Sunday, not every day, but we talked every Sunday. And she said, "What are you working on?" And I told her I was working on feminism. And she said with great intensity, one word, "No." And I said, "What?" She said, "You work on constitutional law, you work on environmental law, you don't do that stuff." And I said, "It's interesting, it's new, I think it's important." And she said, "No, it's terrible, stay away from that, that's horrible, you don't do that." And I said a little bit of what it was, and it became very heated. And my mother had a terrible temper, and boy, did she unleash at me. Stop doing that. And I inherited a little bit of her temper, so she got me mad. And I started saying to her why it was important, why it mattered, just based on what I was reading. And there was a long pause. And my mother basically never paused. That was a very unusual thing for her to do. I wondered whether the connection had gone wrong. There was about a 5-second beat. And then she said 3 words to her son that she had never said before, and she never said since. And she said them with an emotion that I won't be able to capture. It had about 5 different ingredients in it. The 3 words were, "God bless you." And what she was saying then, forgive me, I could tell, was about her life. She was telling me something that she'd probably shared with no one except my dad about experiences she had had that my little rendition about sexual harassment and inequality called up. And she was basically giving me a permission slip, saying something like, "You have no idea." go for it. To that extent, the notion of preference falsification is under-descriptive. Second, sometimes what we're talking about is not falsification of beliefs or values, but experiences. As in the North Korea case, people are concealing or falsifying what actually happened to them. Now that's fake news. Last point. Social movements, including those that the Behavioral Insights team has fueled or accelerated, aren't simply about the revelation of preferences, experiences, beliefs, and values. They're also about their transformation. Any social movement worth celebrating helps to alter people's values and tastes. It casts a new light on the last 20 or 40 or 200 years. It doesn't just elicit pre-existing judgment, it produces novel ones. And if there's anything to remember from these remarks, I hope it's this. Part of the point of many social movements, large and small, and their greatest achievement is to turn a sense of embarrassment and shame into a sense of dignity and hope. Okay, a final word. The world, have you noticed, is in transition? Is that new? Some things that are happening are incredibly good and hopeful all over the world. Some of the things that are happening are less than good and hopeful. What is being falsified might deserve to be falsified. Social norms keep a lot of uncharitable or ugly thoughts out of the public sphere. That's good. It's an achievement. It's central to productive living together. But my remarks have a moral heart, and now I'm going to disclose what it is. People all over the world have thoughts inside their minds about injustice or deprivation. The thought is that things aren't quite right in the workplace, in their family, in their region, in their nation. Human progress depends on someone, somewhere, giving those people a permission slip or a green light. Recall in that light the statement from the computer programmer from Syria. When you meet somebody coming out of Syria for the first time, you start to hear the exact same sentences, that everything is okay, that the economy is doing great, that everything is fine inside Syria. It'll take like 6 months up to a full year for them to become normal human beings again, to say what they think, what they feel. Then they might start whispering. They won't speak loudly, but eventually they're going to. Thanks.
Cass, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. We are at time, but I'm going to take a few liberties and ask Cass a few questions, and I know the audience will have a lot of questions as well. We're not going to have roving mics, but you have the Slido code, and I have the iPad here, so please, if you have questions, pop them on Slido, and I'll come to those. Thank you for that, and I think both you and David made a very compelling case that behavioural science can and should go beyond small tweaks, and we should think about it as a much bigger movement. You've set out that one of the reasons that social change is unpredictable is that even with all the data in the world, we can never really know what's in people's hearts and minds. Do you think that with new forms of data like Google search trends, we might get to a stage where we can better understand and predict social change? And even if we could, do you think that's a desirable place to be?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a book, do you know about it? It's called, I think, Everybody Lies is the name of the book.
Yes.
The speaker's here.
Yes, he is.
Congratulations, the writer of that great book. So it shows that with Google searches, you can find out a lot about what's in people's minds that in the history of humanity you didn't know, about politics, about tastes of every kind. So that's useful. That will show you, I think, more about ripe conditions. So if people are, veganism is going crazy on Google, chances are a lot of people are getting interested in it, and that will be informative about what they're likely to do. It won't tell us the whole story, though, because we won't know what people's thresholds are for actually acting, and we won't know what the social interactions are likely to be. So I'm not sure which of the following is true. Proposition A, that it's a really daunting empirical challenge to do the predictive task. And we'll get there, but it's going to take a while. Or it's in the nature of the beast that it's in principle not knowable. Timur Kuran, the Duke economist who's done the best work on unpredictable revolutions, thinks the second, that it's in principle unpredictable, emphasizing social interactions. As Chou and Lai said about whether the French Revolution was successful, it's too soon to tell.
Okay. And on that point of areas that are ripe for change, what do you think is the role of behavioural scientists, the people in this room, for identifying areas where the prevailing norms might be problematic or might be shifting, and areas that could be ripe for dynamic social norm interventions?
So when I was in the U.S. government and in, occasional informal advisory roles since, I thought the principal answerers of those questions are people who have been appointed to make those calls. So I'm recently back from India, and the leadership there is focused on two issues in particular. One is public health and the other is sex equality. These are highlighted in the economic survey, the amazing discussion of behavioral science in India. And to see those two as areas where there's a great deal to be done would follow from political will. So to ask in whatever country you are, what are things that people who are given the job of making the normative call, what are they focused on? Now, if it's something that makes you excited, all the better. And if it's something that makes you uncomfortable, probably not the best idea to focus on that one. In India, the Prime Minister, this isn't the most lovely set of words, but open defecation, a big issue in India, and a lot of involved behavior change, and there's been substantial success on the part of behaviorally informed actors in producing exactly that. I mean, obvious candidates, anything that involves mental health or poverty or acute deprivation of any kind, health and safety, these seem to be highly agreeable things across political differences. I think one area where there's so much to be done involves deaths on the roads, where these are fully preventable deaths. And as stated in the opening remarks, you can get, probably with relatively modest effort, you can get a lot of people to be living in 2022 who wouldn't otherwise be living then if not for your efforts.
And do you think we should, as policymakers, preempt some of these changes? When I think about the Me Too movement, it gave a lot of women the courage and legitimacy to speak out against sexual harassment. But I'm not sure that our policy response and our legal response really kept pace with that or was strong enough to tackle some of those underlying issues. Do you think where social change happens without that response at the ready, we risk pushing some of these behaviours into a darker, more insidious place?
That's a great question. So it's clear, isn't it, that some social movements involve a lot of public expressions, but don't produce concrete, institutional anything. And it seems like a big success, but in terms of what's actually happening to people, it's much more modest. To think concretely with respect to sexual harassment, let's say, or sexual violence, about what can private institutions do that they're not doing, or what can governments do that they're not doing, and there are multiple possibilities from an intervention that maybe will be one of the 1 in 4 that works, or a guidance document of some kind from a person in authority, which can be constitutive of new norms that can have a kind of displacing of old norms character, something like that. So to think of institutional analogs of movements. I'm smiling because I just learned something recently which I think is replete with implications for behavior change. If you buy electric razors, typically taking them out of a package is a Stephen King novel, meaning there are things inside that are made of plastic or knives alternately that cut you and stymie you. It's not that bad, but they're plastic and they're cutting things, and to get an electric razor out of a box is challenging in the median case. Do you ask, why is he talking about this? Amazon has something called frustration-free packaging, where the thing just comes out. There's no plastic, there's no cuts. It's really easy. Now, I got intrigued. What is frustration-free packaging about? If you look it up, it's about sustainability. It's green. The idea is to have all recyclable, no solid waste, no plastics. It's a green thing. But it induces a positive emotional reaction in the recipients, frustration-free packaging, which you probably wouldn't get as strongly or as uniformly with green packaging. Green will seem for many kind of punitive and virtuous, whereas frustration-free seems joyful and relaxing. And so I think we all should be thinking about the affect induced by the change, and this in the environmental context especially important. Does it have the frustration-free feel, or does it have the feel of, you're doing what you're supposed to do, but you're not smiling when you're doing it?
Absolutely. Cass, we've got a lot of questions coming through about the idea of people's diverse thresholds, and particularly whether you think that there are behavioural interventions we could use to change people's thresholds, or if these are more inherent traits like courage and rebellion.
Okay, so there are the shirts that the Behavioural Insights people who have relevant shirts are wearing, the blue ones, occasionally have a message on them that says 9 out of 10 people are asking me questions.
Yes.
That's a way of triggering thresholds, people with diverse thresholds, to feel free to ask questions. And it's a mundane example. I think so each of us has diverse thresholds for different issues, so it would be tempting to think there's a character trait that is low threshold or high threshold. It's probably more likely to be issue dependent, where some people would go for electric cars with a relatively low threshold or a relatively high threshold. Other people would go for, let's say, some political movement with a very different kind of threshold from the one that would get them to electric cars. So if what's generally true in life is true here, it's issue dependent rather than personality driven. Though that's probably too crude. There are some people who are rebels by nature. They're zeros.
Wonderful. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to move to the final question. Cass, you've summarised your work as being about how to promote fundamental constitutional ideals of equality, dignity, self-government, freedom, the rule of law. What advice would you give to governments and political parties around the world who are seeking to build social movements behind those hopeful ideals?
Thanks. I'll tell you a story that I heard when I was a young law professor, which is that a colleague of mine was working on something abstract, and the dean of the law school at the time said to him, I'll use a fake name, Douglas, solve a problem. So I guess the idea would be to think of something that is concrete and tractable and big and solve it. I would think that we often devote relatively less attention in policymaking to human welfare, oddly, than we should. So to think of, is there an area where there's a large number of premature deaths, or where people are suffering in one way or the other, or whether there's an injustice of some kind. And if you can mix size and tractability, do that today.
Wonderful. That's good advice. Thank you. Before we wrap up this session, I've been asked to tell everybody that morning tea will be out in the foyer until 10:45. If this session has whet your appetite for thinking about the mechanisms of social change, we have some great sessions coming up. Particularly, Professor Robert Schiller will be speaking about narrative economics in the next session, and Professor Jennifer Rubin will be leading a session on how behavioural science can help tackle disinformation. But for now, Cass, thank you so much for such a thought-provoking start to the conference, and please join me in thanking Professor